In today's video, we witness the rarest of all chess openings. That is, the opening in which Magnus Carlsen gets completely blown off the board, finding himself in a hopelessly lost position after making only 12 moves. The chess universe has been dented, my friends, as gravitational chess waves spread across the galaxy emanating from planet Carlsen, which has been rocked to its very liquid magma core and left wobbling on its axis. How could such a thing happen? That's what we're here to answer today as we dive into the nuts and bolts of this wild opening. I'm going to show you some exclusive inside variations you're not going to see anywhere else in this round 6 blitz encounter from Tata Steel, India, in which Magnus Carlsen, playing white and chock full of optimism, opens with e4. It's best by test, validated by victory. He's the world's strongest player and he's playing the world's best opening move. What could possibly go wrong? Well, his prodigious young opponent, none other than the world's number 4, Arjun Erigaisi, responds c5, the Sicilian defense, going for the throat. I just love the way these next-gen Indian players seem to have no fear of Magnus. He's not interested in trying to play it safe with a Petrov or a Berlin. No, those days are gone. Knight to f3 now from Magnus, e6 from Arjun, and it kind of looks like he wants to beat Magnus with the same Taimanov line that Magnus used against him in the last game between these two players that I covered, but Magnus now mixes things up with c4. This is known as the Kramnik variation because it leads to a position that the computer engines have a hard time evaluating correctly and is therefore a very potent weapon against online cheaters. I'm just kidding. Today's top engines evaluate virtually every position correctly, and Kramnik actually played this move back in the 90s against Kasparov, well before anyone was worried about cheating with chess engines. So what does this move actually do? Well, this structure with the white pawns here on c4 and e4, known as the Maroczy bind, is designed to make it harder for black to get in his typical Sicilian pawn breaks d5 or b5. And then once white plays d4 and the d-file opens, then black's backward d-pawn is somewhat weak. So white is going for maximum space and central control here, at the cost of losing a tempo when it comes to piece development, since the more common move here is knight to c3. So Arjun continues knight to c6, we get d4, the exchange of pawns, and now knight to f6, when black has 2 pieces developed compared to white's 1. A fact which gives him ample compensation for white's central pawn control. Okay, so e4 is now under attack. Magnus defends with knight to c3, and now comes bishop to c5. Not a super common move for some reason. Bishop to b4 is much more popular, but this is quite strong. The engine has no objection to it. Black is attacking the knight on d4 with 2 pieces. It's defended only once, so something must be done. So how do you think white should deal with this? It's a very instructional moment because white does have quite a few options. Feel free to pause the video and write down all your candidate moves here, put them in order, rank them, give them cute little names, whatever you want to do, but here they are, white's most reasonable and or noteworthy replies, starting with bishop to e3, which isn't best. You don't really want to keep the knight on d4, since black can just increase pressure with queen to b6, while eyeing that undefended b2 pawn. So while bishop to e3 is playable, it does favor black, so it is best to move this knight from d4, but where should it go? Knight to f3 is no good, as it blocks the white queen's access to g4, allowing knight to g4, hitting f2 twice, to which there is no good defense. Moving the knight to b5 looks tempting, but here black can just castle, just maintaining that lead in development, and he doesn't even mind if the knight gets into d6, since after queen to b6, bishop to f2 with check is a threat, even if white pushes the f-pawn, which is what he's pretty much forced to do, since the white queen can't even move from d1 to help defend f2, since she's got her plate full and pretty much needs to stay on d1, where she's defending against both knight to g4 and bishop takes d6. So this is bad for white. Knight takes c6 is playable, but it pretty much equalizes the position after d takes c6 with the symmetrical pawn structure. A bit better than that would be knight to b3, since it does come with tempo on the black bishop, but after bishop to b4, pinning the knight, black is the one with the threat, which is to take on e4. Bishop takes c3, damaging the white pawn structure, is also on the cards, so this is nothing to get too excited about as white, which brings us to the move played in the game, knight to c2, which is probably the most promising move in the position, with a small advantage for white. The idea is to play bishop to e3 next, to challenge that bishop on c5, supported by the knight. So Arjun continues queen to b6, hitting f2 twice now, to which some defense must be added. But how do you do it? Bishop to e3 now is no good since it removes defense of the b2 pawn. So the move Magnus chooses here just might surprise you. It looks very odd and is most likely computer preparation by someone. This is still opening theory, although quite obscure territory at this point. Take a quick gander, if you'd like, and try to determine what move Magnus plays next. Here it comes. White's best move is queen to d2? Looks kind of ugly, I know, blocking the dark squared bishop's diagonal, but what are the alternatives? Knight to e3 is playable, but it also blocks the dark squared bishop's diagonal. Moving the f-pawn would of course be weakening, opening this diagonal to the g1 square, and white's not going to be castling kingside anytime soon. Queen to e2 is another option, but this of course blocks the light squared bishop's diagonal. I would probably want to play queen to f3 here, but this favors black after something like castles, bishop to e2, when he can get away with the pawn break d5. Rendering white's entire opening plan a bit of a failure, since preventing this move was kind of the whole point of playing c4 in the first place. And if white tries to win a pawn now on d5, he's going to get himself into big trouble due to the vulnerable position of his king. For example, there's this rather pretty variation I want to show you that goes e takes d5, e takes d5, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, c takes d5, when white does have the extra pawn, but black now has a crushing attack beginning with knight to e5, hitting the queen. And after queen to g3, there's bishop to g4, hitting the bishop on e2, threatening to capture there, drawing the white king out, which will not end well for white, who can't even take on g4, like so, or else he actually loses the queen to bishop takes f2 check, and if queen takes f2, here comes the knight fork on d3, picking up the white queen. So this is just one example of how black's superior piece activity can turn deadly very quickly. But getting back to the move played in the game, queen to d2, as odd as it looks, it's actually the best move in the position because it's the only way to both defend f2 and watch over this dark square diagonal to the white king. And you're going to see why this is important very soon. Now, of course, queen to d2 did remove defense from the g4 square, and so now allows Arjun to play knight to g4, which in most other variations is a terrible thing for white, since f2 is now hit thrice, but here white is just fine. And I should mention that black did have other decent moves here, like just castling for instance, but knight to g4 seems to be the most principled, since he does have that lead in development, which will just increase if white wants to keep the knight out of f2, since in order to do so, he's going to have to play the backwards knight to d1. It's the only way to add defense, but this is not Magnus's plan. Instead, he continues with f3, attacking the knight, while preventing bishop to f2 check from being a good move for black, which it would be if it came with the capture of the pawn on f2. But since that pawn has been pushed and the knight is now attacked, here bishop to f2 check just doesn't work out so well tactically. Delve into that mess on your own if you'd like, but here's a clue. The black knight will have to retreat from g4, and then knight to a4 will undermine the black queen's defense of the bishop on f2. But moving along, what we have from Arjun is knight to f2. It is the best move, attacking the rook on h1, and it looks quite nasty. But here, because of the white queen's position on d2, Magnus now has knight to a4 with the fork. Now, if the white queen was not guarding this diagonal, then queen to a5 would come with check, and then black would either pick up the knight on a4 or capture the rook on h1 next, depending on how white responded. But here, of course, white just has queen takes a5, and after knight takes a5, knight takes c5, and knight takes h1, the black knight on h1 is trapped and will eventually be rounded up. Probably best for white will be to just move out these bishops and then castle queenside, picking up the knight with the rook. And then with the two minor pieces for black's rook, not to mention the superior pawn structure, white has an easily winning endgame. So in the game, queen to a5 was of course not played, and neither was bishop to b4, which would allow white to win a whole piece, starting with knight takes b6. Instead, Arjun played the only move that doesn't lose, and that is queen to c7. dropping his bishop on c5 to knight takes c5. Of course, he does get to grab the rook on h1, resulting in a position that looks similar to the variation we just looked at, where the black knight is trapped on h1, and once white wins it, he will have the 2 minor pieces for the rook. But the key difference here is that the queens are still on board, which will enable black to get sufficient counterplay to compensate him. So for the moment, queen takes h2 is threatened. You don't want that. And I'll just briefly show you what the engine says is best for both sides, starting with the move f4, when black should castle, and after bishop to e2, he does get to play his d5, and the engine says that king to f1 is best, headed towards the relative safety of the corner of the board, where it can potentially capture that knight on h1, with a bit of an advantage for white. Again, if white tries to win the pawn on d5, with c takes d5, e takes d5, and e takes d5, then things can start to get real awkward real quick after queen to e7, hitting the knight on c5, pinning this bishop to the king, threatening queen to h4 check. Though white can still possibly survive with an only move, queen to e3, but with his king in the center, lined up with his queen on this opened file, this is quite dangerous for white, and black is the preferred side. The engine's giving queen to h4 check next. But let's take a look at what was played in the game. In this position, after knight takes h1, Magnus played queen to f4. A spectacular blunder, offering the queen trade, which as we saw, would not be good for black, giving white that winning endgame. So I don't think Magnus expected a queen trade here, and I feel like he must have at least seen the first 2 moves of the winning combination that Arjun now has. See if you can spot it. It's black to play and win. Take a look, but here it is. The winning move, queen to a5 check. A simple double attack, hitting the knight on c5 with check. So if king to d1 or to e2, then after queen takes c5, black has too much material and is easily winning. But Magnus does have a move to both get out of check and defend his knight on c5, at least for the moment, and that is b4. Defending c5, defended by the knight on c2. So there is no queen takes b4. However, there is knight takes b4, now played by Arjun. Again, threatening to capture on c5, while also threatening all kinds of nasty discovered checks. Trying to pin this knight with bishop to d2 doesn't work, since knight takes c2 comes with check, and will be followed with queen takes c5. Playing knight takes b4 of course fails, after the recapture with check, again picking up c5 next. Now one move that Magnus possibly could have been counting on to save him is knight to b3. He didn't end up playing this, but on the surface it looks kind of reasonable, getting the knight out of danger with an attack on black's queen, which would be great for white if black was only threatening a simple discovered check once his knight on b4 moves somewhere. But unfortunately, Arjun is threatening a double discovered check, with either knight takes c2 or knight to d3, since both moves would deliver check with 2 pieces at the same time, which of course means white must move the king, and therefore does not have the option to capture the queen with knight takes a5. So I'll just show you knight to d3 check. Even though knight takes c2 check is a bit more obviously crushing, this move knight to d3 is a fork of the white king and queen, so maybe Magnus was fixated on this move at some point in his calculations and just spaced out on the move knight takes c2, who knows? But in this position, after king to d1, it almost looks like white might survive. His queen is attacked, but then again, black's queen is still attacked as well, and white would indeed have a glimmer of hope if black did not now have the devastating knight h to f2 check, when the white king has but one legal move, and that is to step onto the poisoned e2 square. Why is it poisoned? Well, it's because the black knight can now capture the queen on f4 with check, meaning that white will not be capturing the queen on a5, and after king takes f2, queen to b6 check, white is hopelessly down in material and will definitely lose. So in the game, Magnus Carlsen, realizing the hideous truth about knight to b3, with a heavy heart and visibly unhappy, played the tragic king to d1. At which point Arjun could just grab the knight on c5 with a totally winning position, but he has a proclivity for top engine moves, which is why he goes for knight to f2 check. Now if the white king moves to a dark square, Then there comes a nasty discovered check, which will win the white queen. So Magnus plays king to e2, removing defense from the knight on c2, which is now promptly removed from the board with knight takes c2, putting Arjun a full rook up now, and threatening checkmate in one move with queen to e1. Magnus answers this threat with bishop to e3, defending his knight on c5, but leaving his rook on a1 undefended. He could have defended against the mate with bishop to b2, but then black would just take the knight on c5, which would defend his knight on f2. Either way, Magnus is totally finished. So in the game, after knight takes a1, played by Arjun, you would think Magnus would now take the knight on f2, if he didn't just resign, which at this point would be more fashionably late than early. But he leaves this knight alone, and instead tries to get tricky with queen to e5. And this is just sheer desperation. Okay, he's hitting the pawn on g7, attacking the knight on a1. Is he hoping Arjun will defend the g7 pawn with king to f8, allowing Magnus to win his queen with knight takes d7 check? Weirder things have happened, but not in this game. Arjun continues queen takes a2 check. Magnus blocks with the bishop. We have f6 next, attacking the queen. She goes to d6. The knight on c5 is attacked with b6. At which point Magnus goes down in a blaze of glory with the spectacular knight takes e6. And when I say spectacular, I of course mean in the self-destructive kind of way, not as in it's a strong move or anything, since even if black plays d takes e6, allowing the fork, with queen to c6 check, picking up the rook, white will still be down way too much material to survive, but Arjun plays an even better move than d takes e6, and that is queen takes c4 check, resulting in a resignation of the game by Magnus Carlsen, seeing that once he gets out a check, queen takes e6 is next, and all is lost. So thank you for joining me through this opening nightmare of Magnus Carlsen's, in which he was brutally annihilated at the hands of one of the brightest lights in the entire chess firmament, Arjun Erigaisi, an unrelenting chess beast, hungry and hellbent on dethroning the great and mighty Magnus from his coveted seat of power. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and/or subscribe if you feel like it, and I will see you very soon.